Welcome to Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm health integrationist Lena Berman with Jeff Fawcett, PhD, and we come to you weekly with a critical, independent voice on the politics and practice of health. There's something sinister coming our way. It's, as usual, cloaked in benign, even environmental clothing, and it will use taxpayers' money to line the pockets of some very wealthy corporations. If that doesn't sound sinister enough, it will also give these same people the ability to bounce radiation off and onto the houses, into the houses in your neighborhood, whether you want it or not. And it will monitor your power use and who knows what else. It's the smart grid, and it's scheduled to arrive as soon as next month. This in the name of global warming. Funny how it smells of something else. And in case you've not already read Alex Colburn's article in the January 4th issue of The Nation magazine, I suggest you do. He points out that the Climeric Research Unit at University of East Anglia was founded in 1971 with funds from, among others, Shell Oil and British Petroleum. Global warming looks like it's becoming big business, so big that it's being manipulated into something that mandates trespassing on citizens' home without consent using taxpayers' money. Many big, powerful people get control of our energy, and we pay for it. Does this sound like we're getting energy independence? Join us as we expose this not-so-smart grid. Because of the amount of information we need to cover today, we'll be foregoing our usual editorial about this week's health news by Jeff Fawcett, PhD, but he does join us today. Please note also that we will be doing a book signing for Too Much Medicine, Not Enough Health this Saturday, the 9th, at Book Passage in Corte Madera at 4 p.m. So let's get down to business, and I'll introduce our two guests I have by phone. B. Blake Levitt, an award-winning journalist who has specialized in medical and science writing for nearly 2 decades. She has researched the biological effects of non-ionizing radiation since the 1970s. A former New York Times writer, she has written widely on medical issues for both the lay and professional audience. She's written and contributed to several books, including her own book, Electromagnetic Fields, A Consumer's Guide to the Issues and How to Protect Ourselves, for which she won an Award of Excellence from the American Medical Writers Association. And we also have Michael Neuert, N-E-U-R-E-T, who is an electrical engineer with over 17 years of professional experience in the measurement and remediation of electromagnetic fields. He's also written extensively on the subject. Michael has designed and installed several EMF-free wiring systems for dozens of homes in California. So welcome to both of you. Michael's nodding from a distance.
Hi, Lena.
Hi.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Briefly, I wanted to say that I was on the phone with PG&E for unrelated business when they dropped this little piece of business about the new smart grid, which was on its way. And I had a long conversation with the customer service person explaining that I was a health educator and I knew a lot about this and I didn't want it, and I wanted to know if there was a way for me to opt out. I got passed on up the ladder in PG&E until I talked to some kind of person who was the supervisor of the supervisor of the supervisor, who kept calling me ma'am and saying, yes, ma'am, when I said, what about people with medical devices? What about people who are electrosensitive, which is 30% of the population? What about this? He just kept saying, yes, ma'am, and told me to call the PUC. I called the PUC, and they said, why are you calling us? You have to talk to PG&E. Called PG&E back. The PUC actually told me I had to talk to a specific person at PG&E who they couldn't give me the number of, so they connected me to this person. I got this secretary who knew none of the even most rudimentary terms used to discuss this stuff. She took notes as I exploded, on the phone to her with citing all sorts of research and going on. And I finally ended by saying, you're going to go back to your bosses and they're going to tell you that they did a industry paid for study that shows that this is a very low level and that it's not going to cause any problems, but that's not true. And I cited 2 animal studies where it shows that the blood-brain barrier is breached, chemicals get in, and the neurons in the brain are killed permanently when being exposed to these extremely low levels. So the lower the level isn't safer. In any case, they promised they would get back to me. She got back to me, said, oh, yeah, there's a study, and it shows, and I told her what it said, and I said, I told you that, and she said, oh, yeah, and said that someone would call me, which they never did, of course, even though I made a point of saying I was with the media. The only thing I know is that it's scheduled to show up very soon in California. So,
do your listeners actually know what we're talking about yet?
Well, go for it.
I think we need to back up just a little bit here. The show is on smart grid technologies, right?
Yes, dear, it is.
Okay. A lot of people associate smart grid technologies with something very good, very beneficial, very high tech, very wonderful. You know, let's go for this. And that's if anyone has actually paid attention to it at all. As soon as you attach the word smart to something, people tend to have a very favorable response to it, especially if it has to do with technology, because after all, who wants dumb technology? I mean, we want it as smart as we can possibly get it. What people don't realize is that when you attach that word to grid, as in electrical grid, you're dealing with a whole different kind of system. Now, there have been two different phases to building out smart grids. Phase one has been pretty much implemented across the country. But first, the reason that we're doing a show on smart grids is because there is a possibility, given what is known in some science circles, that this could be damaging to both the health and the environment for reasons that we'll get into a little bit down the line. But just to explain very briefly, phase one of smart metering, which is what it was called, and most people will remember with the electric company that there was a meter reader that used to come up to the house or come up to someone's business and attach a little device to your meter outside the house, which was looked like a little bit of a bubblegum machine attached to the house that had some meters that were constantly spinning, and they would attach a device to it and it would take a reading and off they would go, and a couple of days later you would get your bill. That involved people actually getting out of vans and walking up to houses. Well, about 7, maybe 10 years ago, the major utility companies across the country started to attach a different kind of a meter, which was a radio frequency meter to houses that didn't require a meter reader to get out of the van to come up to the house. What those meters did was they transmitted your electrical usage data from the meter to a van that would pick it up via an antenna. It would be a remote system, communication system between your house and the van. That allowed them, from a business perspective, to cut down on the amount of employees that were required to pull this off. From a business model, it looked pretty happy. The only problem was that some people started to react badly to RF meters because it creates something called dirty electricity on the lines, which we'll also get into a little bit later and why that's a concern. So that system, was kind of gradually built out across the country for the last several years, but now we're going into something called phase two, which is, they didn't really think of it in terms of phase one, phase two, it's just sort of developed that way. Phase two is a whole different kind of deal. This is a major reconstruction of how electric generation and usage is going to be conducted across the country. It's a whole different kind of system. Some components of it are good and make a lot of sense, but when you look at the actual way that it's going to be implemented, that's when things begin to get a little on the dicey side for anybody from the bioelectromagnetics community and from some quadrants of the environmental community when they actually take a look at the what's involved with the technology. Now, the purpose of phase two of the smart grids, if you look at the literature from any of the providers or from the government agencies that are promoting this, what they're hoping to do, and these are good goals, are to increase the reliability of the system. Nobody likes it when the system crashes and the lights go out. They want to increase the security of the system, which I'm not sure that this does. As a science writer, it looks to me like they're actually going to be making it more insecure.
Yeah, it's just the contrary. Everybody who knows anything about intelligence, information technology is saying this is going to be a terrorist's, ball. It's going to be
it has the ability
party.
to see that. They're also hoping that it will increase the efficiency of the system, ultimately leading to less energy consumption, which is the goal that we're all involved with, having to do with less energy consumption, greener technologies, and things like that. The only problem is that this is going to entail an entirely new metering and monitoring system, unlike anything that we've seen before. This current go-round of smart grids builds on the existing system, which is old. It's been overtaxed. It's been worn out, and with all of the increasing demands that we put on it for all of our new technologies, I don't think anybody would argue with the fact that we need to pay attention to upgrading our electrical system. They're also proposing new power line corridors are envisioned to bring electricity from areas where more green technologies are available, but there's no transmission lines that go into them. For instance, potential wind farms off the coast of Maine where there's a lot of wind, but no power lines go into them. They foresee new corridors being created there, or new corridors being created in desert areas where there's a lot of sun, and things like that. So to some extent, those are worthy goals. At least in theory, it's a question of always, the devil's in the details and how we pull that off. Now, what makes the system smart is the so-called interoperability of the various component parts. The problem is that the smart aspect of this, when it reaches the consumer and has to do with the metering and the monitoring, is that it involves the use, a much higher allowance use and a constant use for radio frequency radiation from new meters that will be attached to the house that will be two-way transceivers between the electrical appliances in the house, meaning your furnace, your air conditioner, your washing machine, your refrigerator, your freezer, whatever is required to use electrical power, will have a transmitter that will be transmitting data to another transmitter that will be then transmitting data to a central power hub in a neighborhood that will collect the data. Now, these are very low-powered units. That is true, but it is largely beside the point, because the low-power aspect is usually compared to a national standard or an international standard that is based on a very faulty and obsolete assumption that the only adverse effects that are caused by these exposures are thermal effects, which have the ability to heat human tissue. Now, there has been just a wealth of studies over the last 20 to 25 years that have found adverse and other biological effects from exposures that are substantially below what those standards are. So anything that you see that touts the percentage, how much lower these systems will be from what is allowed, is actually comparing to something that it shouldn't be compared to. We should be comparing, when you take a look at the system, we should be considering the aggregate exposures from all of the appliances that will be required, from the aggregate exposures of all of the meters that will be transmitting in a neighborhood, and it should be also taken into consideration the aggregate exposures of individual consumer products that are already in the house, like other wireless routers, cell phone usage, wireless decked products, decked phones, other cordless phones, and any other wireless product. So, because the problem is that if you look at this just one technology and one application at a time, everything looks like it's all very low powered. You put the whole thing together and it might not be. One of the good things that could come of this is has to do with the capacity of consumers to monitor their electrical usage in real time. I mean, I don't want to do that, and I don't think most people want to do that, but this is one of the benefits that they're touting. It will allow people to access their own appliances. I mean, aren't you just dying to be, at your office and, remotely control your washing machine or your oven before you get home? But it will allow you to do things like, for instance, see real-time usage, how much energy is costing per kilowatt hour, say 5 cents per kilowatt hour at 9 p.m. versus 15 cents per kilowatt hour at 2 p.m., allow you to make a decision on when you're going to do your laundry, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that most people are going to pay that kind of micro-attention to their energy usage, but this is one of the things that they're using as a hot selling point, which is that it's going to provide consumer control control. It will also, however, the smart grid system, one of the sidelines of it, aside from personal metering, is that it also creates possibilities for way stations, for plug-in hybrids and electric cars, for municipal lighting management possibilities. So, I mean, those are potentially good aspects of this for the people that would want that kind of a capacity, but I don't think that most people would want that.
I should just mention that the organization TURN, TURN, which monitors utility usage, is very, very much against the smart grid, and it isn't just because they've received over 100 complaints about huge bills all of a sudden. But the other reason is that they say...
the bugs in these systems are
they're very buggy. They're very buggy. But they also say that the system depends on consumers buying enormously expensive equipment.
Yes.
Communication devices, computers, high-speed internet access, special thermostats, special chips for their appliances, other automated equipment. It says the cost of refitting or replacing existing appliances will be astronomical and obviously out of reach for many people. And they suggest that an upgraded grid, where the smarts will come from consumers rather than from expensive devices controlled by the utility company. So one of the things you're not mentioning is that the utility company can, in fact, monitor inside your house.
Oh, yes, there are privacy concerns, very, very important privacy concerns. Not just that. I mean, just imagine, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but I mean, just imagine the ability of other devices to tamper with a system like this. You know, say a cell phone drive. Let me just say that these smart grid systems are operating at 2.45 gigahertz. That's what the main hubs are going to be. But that's awfully close to many consumer products. I mean, just imagine. I can imagine a worst-case scenario with radio frequency interference in which somebody would be driving by with a cell phone or a wireless laptop, or even some of the new capacities for cars that are creating radar systems all around themselves for remote detection of wildlife so that they don't have collisions on the road. I can imagine something like that, tripping one of these devices in the house and setting off an oven when it's not supposed to be on, or doing any number of things. I mean, worst case scenarios are very easy to imagine out. Now they say that that most of this will be shielded, but I cannot imagine how they would shield anything well enough to stop the kinds of problems that can be envisioned by this. So yes, there are major problems, Lena. I didn't mean to.
Well, no, it's starting to sound like a good idea. Let me just say
I'm just saying that there are reasons.
Right.
You can't say why something is bad unless you figure out why somebody wants to do it.
Okay, let me just say this is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm with Jeff Fawcett, as always. I'm Lena Berman. I have Michael Neuert here as well, and we're on the phone right now with Blake Levitt discussing the smart grid. So please go ahead. I have a list of things that I'm worried about with this, but go ahead. I'm sure you'll get to it.
Okay, yeah, I sure will. I just wanted to say for the listening audience that this seems like it's a brand new thing. There's been a lot of accelerated enthusiasm about this within the past year. The Obama administration is very much in favor of this, as is the director or the head of all of the various agencies. The Department of Energy is one of the largest proponents of this, and big guys like Siemens and General Electric.
They're going to make an enormous amount of money.
They already are. A lot of the funding for this came through stimulus dollars through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which allotted something like $3.2 billion during the first year, and another $3-point-something billion recently. It came through the U.S. House Energy and Environment Committee through Henry Waxman. The Electric Power Research Institute is involved with this, the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. All of the big players are involved with this and have certainly lined up and have gotten not only very much on board, but there are already fairly large prototypes of smart grids that are being built out. So this is not theoretical anymore. It's well funded. It's not particularly well thought out. However, I think there are some really important things that need to be ironed out before we just embrace this entire thing on a national level. So anyway, some of the problems that I foresee are it's just the fundamental question of, do people really want to be able to talk to their appliances? Do they want the utilities to be able to talk to their appliances? Do any of us want to micromanage our lives that way?
Well, I have other concerns. I mean,
plus the radio frequency radiation exposures. Yes. These are going to be complete involuntary exposures.
Well, but
and they're going to be 24/7. Even though the smart grid will only be transmitting data, say, a couple of times an hour.
No, that's not true. That's one of the reasons that Michael Neuert is here, because Michael has actually gone out and measured these, and indeed they are bursting. Was it every minute? Do you want to comment? You have to get close to the microphone.
Sure. In my preliminary tests around the Bay Area, smart meters on both electric meters and gas meters, it looks like they tend to put out a burst of RF information every minute or so. Mm-hmm. It varies a little bit. It's kind of like popcorn style when it comes out. When I've done time tests, I get about an average of every 45 seconds. Uh-huh. And there's a lot going on there with the RF, with the meters. The meters on the house are not just sending the information for that house.
That's right.
They're also acting as repeaters for some of the other houses and meters nearby.
That's right.
Yeah, it's one of the ways that they keep the power levels of the system low, rather than have a large, very strong signal go a far distance like a cell phone tower. Mm-hmm. They're tending to make a smaller signal that goes several hundred feet. Maybe another house picks it up, transmits that to the next house, and then you get to the tower perhaps on the street, the antenna.
Yeah, so we have additional antennas, we have additional towers, we have microwave bouncing off of houses onto other houses as well as into houses, whether you sign up for this or not.
That's right. It's called a mesh network.
Yes.
MESH
Jeffrey
network.
has something, yeah.
Well, this is akin to, I've seen this on the internet, it's an underground movement of how to create a wireless network in your neighborhood, and this is a very similar thing. Basically, people in their own homes turn their computers, their own wireless routers, into these kinds of send and receive devices, so that instead of having as Michael described, a centralized wireless tower antenna that serves the neighborhood, it's each computer is serving as a part of the distribution network. So, again, chances are, since this is being promoted by organizations like Media Alliance as a way for people to have their own wireless networks, this is yet this concept of layering that Blake discussed earlier, of adding yet another layer on existing exposures.
Let me just, I'll let you go in a second, Blake, but let me just make this very clear to people. The reason I'm doing these shows, because I had at least one person comment on my work saying that they really loved my radio show, but they thought I should get off all this stuff about the wireless. The reason I'm concerned is because I see clients in my office and on the phone, and the number of people who are ill now from electrical sensitivity is increasing exponentially so fast that it would make your head spin. And one of the things that's going on is that people don't know that they're reacting to this technology. They're just getting worse and worse and worse, and they're taking more and more medications, and their systems are breaking down, and they're beginning to have heart symptoms. They've got hypertension. They're ending up on drugs. And when I work with them, if I can get them to get out of the wireless environment for a short time, or even turn off some of the exposures that they can control in their environment, their symptoms shift. And children are at risk in ways that I can't even mention. So I read the research. I'm a health educator. I am extremely concerned about what's coming, and I'm also concerned about something like 20 million people who have medical implants, who this will interfere with. The rates of fertility are dropping like a rock. Maybe that's a good thing because of this. I'm worried about this business of bouncing signals all over the place. I'm worried about the preemption in the laws of the local and state control over it. I'm wondering about the malfunction of one of these huge systems. Every time I show, you sent me this report that was done in Canada that's supposed to reassure everybody. I showed it to an IC specialist who was over at my house last night. She looked at it very slowly and started to grok what was going on, and then she shook her head violently and said, "I don't want this. Yeah. I don't want this."
Yeah. No, I can't imagine anybody that wants this except the people that are actually sort of forcing it down our throats.
Okay, so go for it some more.
Oh, okay. It's not just humans that we have to worry about when it comes to these low level exposures. I don't even know where to start with that one.
Well, one thing we can talk about is cancer.
Well, what I wanted to do first, before we go
and the next generation with DNA breaks and cancer.
I just wanted to talk about the ubiquity of what this is going to create.
Yes.
Now, low level is one thing. Ubiquitous 24-hour exposures is a whole other kind of thing. Even if it's bursting out 1 minute from say my house, and say every minute from the next house, and it's the data system talking back and forth between this network, that network back to the various data points of information with the utility companies. The exposures that this are going to create, yes, are yet another ubiquitous blanket of electrosmog. There have been studies that I just co-authored a paper that will be coming out next year on the ubiquitous exposures from cell towers, and these exposures will be comparable to that. It's amazing that people will fight a cell tower in a neighborhood. But then a national power grid like this will come along that will create essentially a comparable exposure.
Well, and there's literally going to be in the chart that they have in this report, it shows towers and repeaters and antennas everywhere.
Every couple of
and your house is an antenna.
Your house is a transceiver. It's an antenna that receives and transmits at any point in time.
And, in Sweden, electrosensitive people, I might mention, again, 30% of us are, and it's going up very rapidly, and children are very much at risk. In Sweden, electrosensitive people are considered to be people who have a disability, and they're given special housing.
Yeah.
This is a situation where we're going to have to go live in a mine shaft.
Yeah. People are reacting very poorly who are living within so much as 1,500 feet of a cell tower. I can't imagine that we're going to have anything less with this kind of technology that's made unavoidable.
And then, as you say, the birds and the bees and all the rest of it.
Several studies have found not only elevated cancer rates, as you were talking about before, Lena, after living for 10 years near a cell tower, but the complaints are immediate for things like headaches, skin rashes, sleep disturbances, depression, decreased libido,
anxiety,
rates of suicide, concentration problems, dizziness, memory changes, tremors, and a host of neurophysiological effects that come along. And these are all non-thermal, very low-level exposures. And here comes the utility companies that are going to make it impossible to avoid those kinds of exposures. You're not the only one that is contacted by people that have electromagnetic hypersensitivity. There probably isn't a week that doesn't go by that I don't see somebody who's got exactly those kinds of complaints.
The other concern I have is that we know from 2 studies now, very big, credible studies, Henry Lai and somebody else repeated the study, that this radiation does break DNA strands, which means that the DNA damage will be inherited by the next generation.
That's right. There are probably about 12 studies now that have found DNA damage at these very low-intensity exposures. The exposure parameter is slightly different. It's not quite like an X-ray. The end product is the same as ionizing radiation and X-ray exposures, which are known to break chemical bonds. With these exposures, it's a little more like Chinese water torture. It takes longer to occur, but when you get these kinds of 24-hour ubiquitous exposures, that's exactly the exposure that you're setting up. So yes, what that means, it's interesting what that means, is the implications of that one body of work implies that there's really no biological difference at the cellular level between ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation. and it's the non-ionizing bands where, particularly with radio frequency radiation exposures, that are the ones that are increasing exponentially. One thing that I'd like to say whenever I'm on the radio, I make this point. It sort of helps people understand what's being talked about. Radio frequency radiation is a form of energetic air pollution. We just don't think of it that way. And the more source points, transmission points that we put in, the more electrosmog we create. And that's true for a cell phone, for a smartphone, for a decked phone, for a wireless laptop, and it sure as heck is true for these smart grid proposals that are coming along too.
So,
I just wanted to say a little bit about wildlife.
Yeah, I want you to do that, but I need to take a very brief musical break. When I come back, Blake Levitt, we'll discuss more about the effect on wildlife, but I also want to give Michael a chance to get in there, and I also want us to talk about what we can do as consumers, because I think we can make a lot of trouble if we all get together and do this.
Okay, there's something I also wanted to ask Michael.
Okay, so we'll be right back. This is Lena Berman, Your Own Health and Fitness with Jeff Fawcett. We're talking about the not-so-smart grid, and we will be back after this. Welcome back. This is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman with Jeff Fawcett, PhD. We're doing a show today on the not-so-smart grid. We're with B. Blake Levitt at blakelevitt.com, and we have Michael Neuert with us. Oops, I can't remember your website, Michael.
emfcenter.com.
emfcenter.com. And there's information about Your Own Health and Fitness, our guests, our book signing this Saturday at a book passage in Corte Madera, Saturday at 4. Our practice, our archive, access to CD copies, lots more too at yourownhealthandfitness.org. Book page, Facebook page for Too Much Medicine, Not Enough Health. Also, you can join us there. And our information number is 707-874-2772. So, Blake, you wanted to say something about wildlife, and then you had a question for Michael.
Yeah. Wildlife is known to be fantastically sensitive to very low-level electromagnetic field exposures. They use it for any number of species, like birds and butterflies and fish, and in fact, all species use electromagnetic fields in one way or another, either for migration or for mating or for communicating with each other. They're just replete with electromagnetic sensibilities that the human race doesn't have. But bees, in particular, a lot of people are aware of whole colony collapse issues. There's some interesting work was done in Europe in which they simulated directional collapse in honeybee hives by putting cell phones into the hives and turning them on for a couple of seconds, and then letting the bees out. And in situations like that, the bees absolutely failed to return to the hives, and these were non-thermal exposures. There's a possibility that these low-level ubiquitous exposures are contributing, at least, if not as a primary factor in whole colony collapse, then probably as a cofactor in immune system suppression. Bees, for instance, are known to have what are called magnetite clusters in their belly areas. Magnetite is a natural occurring mineral that is something like 3 million times more responsive to external magnetic fields than any other known material on Earth. And bees' abdominal areas have a very thick cluster of magnetite that they use to as a navigational tool. As a matter of fact, there was a scientist named von Frisch who won the Nobel Prize back in, I think, the early 1980s for what was called the discovery of the honeybee dance, in which he was talking about how honeybees will figure out where the best pollinating flowers are, go back to the hive and dance out a very elaborate signal to their hive mates using the sun as a vector coordinator to describe where the pollinating honey is. If you screw around with their navigational abilities, they obviously can't do that, and that's just one species, but it's a seminal species. I think it was Albert Einstein said that we would all live for only approximately 3 years if something happened to the honeybees. Well, it would appear that it's happening. We're also getting on the East Coast anyway something called white nose syndrome in bats. It's a fungal infection that is just decimating whole bat populations out here. There are any number of immune system difficulties that are affecting some other species, and they keep looking for individual causes, but no one is looking for sort of overriding immune system suppression factors, environmental factors, and they're not looking for ubiquitous exposures such as radio frequency radiation. But if you think about it, that is the one thing that we have absolutely irreparably changed on an environmental and global level within the last 10 years with the advent of telecommunications technology. And so if you add just, say, 1% more to that electrosmog aspect, who knows what kinds of environmental effects there are going to be. The other point that I'd like to make is that the standards that are in place at the FCC and throughout other industrialized countries, not only are they only for thermal effects, but they're only for human effects. There are no standards for wildlife pollution when it comes to this. And there's this interesting new theory that's coming out of possibly going to be developed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that may be going in the direction of considering air as habitat. It's a fascinating concept if you think about it. It's easy for us to get our minds around the fact that water is habitat for fish, but we don't understand air as habitat for anything. We think of birds and insects and bats as sort of flying through it, but we don't consider it as habitat for their essential life's doings the way we do fish with water. If we begin to consider air as habitat, then radio frequency radiation as an energetic air pollution would definitely play a factor in trying to regulate some of these aggregate background levels.
Okay. So. It's not sounding terribly green to me, but I'm an extremist.
It's not green. It's not green.
Not
but
green.
Unfortunately, the smart grid technologies have been very widely embraced by the progressive community and by the environmental community because they were sold a bill of goods that completely leaves the functioning of the system and radio frequency radiation and the biological effects. It leaves all of that right off the table.
Right.
Everything that I've read about this says nothing about that whatsoever. It's taken a very long time to even figure out exactly how these systems are going to work.
But I know you have a question for Michael. I have a question for you as well. How did you manage to mess with your energy company? You did something where you insisted that they had to deliver this through your landline?
I'm in Connecticut, and our utility provider is Northeast Utilities. And when they did put the Phase 1 smart meter on our house, I came home. I had been out, came home, and noticed that there was a different meter on the house. There were tracks in the snow that were leading up to the house, and I looked at it and I went, "Oh my God, that's an RF meter." So I called the couple of phone calls, called the meter manager, introduced myself, and I said, "You got to get this off the house. I want my mechanical meter back." They did put a mechanical meter back, and I read my own meter for something like a year. But there is another possibility for the older. Now this is Phase 1. This is not Phase 2.
Right. It sounds like we're screwed with Phase 2.
We're kind of screwed with Phase 2 unless people just stand up and say, I do not want.
Okay, so that's where we're going next. So you want to ask Michael a question?
No, because the Phase 1 might be a part of the solution for where we need to go with Phase 2. Now, what I did with my company was they offered me a solution that would tie my meter directly into my landline phone. A cord, so that they get a daily reading of our electric use that goes out over the phone line. Now, there is no reason why that can't happen sort of nationally if we get our minds around the fact that we need to create a safer environmental way to meter and monitor our energy usage.
Yeah, but won't that put RF on your phone line?
If you filter it and if you choke it, if you use chokes, my understanding of that is needs to be certainly augmented. But there are ways to filter energy use so that you can create much safer transmission possibilities.
Yeah, that's not what they're playing. So ask Michael a question, because I have some questions for Michael as well, and I'd like him to weigh in.
The question that I wanted to ask Michael is that when I was reading the report that we had talked about before, there was a distinction between the duty cycle of the transmission and the peak power cycle. It looked to me like the peak power cycle was significantly higher than the duty cycle. Did you pick up on any of that, Michael? It could be a factor almost as 20 times higher, 20 times greater.
Yeah.
For example, if the duty cycle were 5%, then the instantaneous peak power density could be greater by almost a factor of 20.
Exactly. That's right. Right.
So so the peak power density is not a 1 watt transmission thing again? What am I missing here?
Oh, usually in their reports, they are reporting the peak level.
They are?
Yeah, usually. In that particular report, I'm not sure.
I thought that they were doing an average over 6 minutes.
I actually couldn't say to that. I don't know.
Jeffrey had something.
So for the benefit of listeners, could we have an explanation of what that technical talk means in terms of exposure? Just what does that mean in terms of what we're exposed to?
Yeah, I can use the example of the smart meters here in Northern California that I've measured, and a lot of the wireless technologies will do this. The old analog technologies tend to send a signal over an entire time period. There was a signal that was happening the whole time. And with digital technologies, you're often packing a lot of signal information into a very short period of time. So you're making a little burst of information, and then it might be quiet. Like what I've seen with the smart meters is maybe there's a fraction of a second, there's near the meter something in the range of look at my notes, I think it was around a microwatt per centimeter squared near the meter, and then it'll be quiet for maybe 30 seconds, a minute, like that. And so the duty cycle has to do with how much of the time is the signal actually happening, and in some cases it's a very short part of the time.
Okay, so the reason that would be important for the listeners, the reason that would be important, and correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, is that when you get a peak power exposure like that, it simulates what's called a transient exposure, which is a momentary higher exposure.
Yes.
Now, with a transient exposure, some of the research has found that it is that transient peak power exposure in and of itself that has been the biologically active factor. There was a study, I think, done up in Canada several years ago. I don't think it was released. It was done by one of the utility companies, one of the hydroelectric companies up there, I think, that found increases in lung cancer in electrical workers, and it was the peak transient exposure itself that was the factor that was involved with that. So for the listening audience, there are a bunch of different exposure parameters that have been delineated and have been looked at in the bioelectromagnetics community. So it's not just the low power aspect of it. It's not just the ubiquity of it. It's not just the frequency of it. It's not just whether it complies with the standards. It actually has to do with the signaling characteristic itself. And these will be pulsed digital signals that have a peak power density aspect to them. And all of those factors have been both individually and in the aggregate found to be biologically important.
Exactly.
Okay, so Michael, you measured these things. You work with people who are trying to reduce their exposure to these things. Can you just talk about your concerns here, what you're seeing, what you're concerned about, what ideas you have about this?
Sure.
And then I want all of us to talk about what we want consumers to do. I know for one thing I want people to get on the phone and jam the lines of the appropriate people, but we should talk about what that would mean. So,
sure.
Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, in my experience, what we're doing with our smart grid technology that's coming in a lot of parts of the country is we're adding another layer, as Blake was saying, to our total EMF exposure. And in particular, these are relatively low levels as compared to what's allowed by the FCC, for instance. But they are definitely in the range that's probably bioactive, and definitely anecdotally, people who are sensitive types have issues with these fields. And so the way it works is there's a couple different ways that the fields get to you. There's a direct RF energy that'll go from the meter, your meter, and also your neighbor's meters. You think of what are the, where are the meters around you, and you look at where the ones are for your neighbors also, because sometimes your neighbor's is closer to your bedroom than your own. And it's the closer the meter, of course, the stronger the field in general. And so there's that kind of direct energy, and usually that'll be a measurably an obvious level of something you can measure with a standard RF meter that'll be higher than the background level for about 15, 20, maybe even 30 feet, depending on the
but they're
background.
also bouncing this off people's houses.
And then that's sort of the primary energy that goes to you direct from the meter. Then you do have the fact that RF tends to bounce off other surfaces, so other walls.
No, but they're
hills.
using antennas and houses to
Yes.
bounce the energy around.
And that's correct. So you also have the added exposures of not just your own, but all the other antennas that are around you that are kind of repeating the same signal. That's correct. Yeah. So you have, what happens is you have a direct exposure from the meter, but then from all around you, you have a lower level that's coming from all directions. Right.
This is Your Own Health and Fitness. I'm Lena Berman with Jeff Fawcett. We're listening right now to Michael Neuert, Neuret, who is an electrical engineer. Your website, again, is
EMFcenter.com.
Center.com. And we also have Blake Levitt in the background here, who's going to probably add some more stuff too. Blake Levitt at blakelevitt.com. In terms of shielding, it's going to be very difficult. I mean, you'd basically have to cover, first of all, you'd have to shield yourself from the meter, and then the meter doesn't do its job, and then the electrical company tells you they're not going to do this.
It's not going to be possible to shield for this.
Okay.
Not really.
Could I back up for a minute? So, Michael, you were talking about the primary source for these, and then you started to go on, and whenever I hear primary source, my brain goes to secondary and tertiary sources. So there is some discussion of dirty electricity and how these devices feed into that. So why don't you talk some about that? And in addition, this groovy thing where you're going to be able to monitor all of your appliances, when my understanding is that the next generation of appliances are going to be automatically equipped with RF signals themselves so that they can talk to these meters, and you will not be able to disable those.
Yes.
Consumers
without voiding your warranty.
Without voiding the warranty.
Absolutely disabling the machine.
So I think I just kind of answered, but talk some about those
and dirty electricity.
those additional exposures added by this technology.
One of my biggest concerns working with electrosensitive people is that a lot of people are sensitive to, we call it dirty electricity. It's where the fields, the EMFs, the low-frequency EMFs from your own wiring, the power lines also, but your own wiring is very close. That field, which is already perhaps carcinogenic, already is affecting our immune systems, that field becomes dirtier. It carries other signals and frequencies, transients, that make it a dirtier field, and that dirty part of that field seems to be trouble for a lot of people. And so whenever you have something, and I see this all the time, because if you go around with an RF meter, you'll see these different RF fields are collapsing on conductive surfaces. You'll go around near the sink, it'll be higher there because the sink is acting as a metal sink is acting as a secondary antenna, or the oven. And our bodies do the same thing. We pick up the fields on our skin. So what I've noticed over the years is a great majority of the people who are RF sensitive right now, who already are having difficulties with the new technologies coming in. An unbelievable number of times, those people have been living in a strong field from their building wiring over the years. And what that would mean is that their building wiring, electric fields, with the dirty electricity that's already been there for many years from our computers and things like that, they've already been kind of oversensitized to RF exposures on their skin from from their building wiring. And then when the new technologies come along, they've actually had a RF experience longer than the rest of us.
Well, and it's cumulative. People get worse over time.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so we don't have very much time left. There are two issues. One is that it really does look like we're not going to be able to shield ourselves from this. And it sounds like the only option is going to be to tell PG&E that you want to have your power turned off and then shield your house from the neighboring
Well,
signals.
there's two things I would recommend that you can do. You can do some shielding of the primary field, the direct field from the meters. You can put a shielding material in between you and the meter, not completely surrounding it so you stop the field completely, but so that the part that comes directly from the meter to you, that can be shielded.
Yeah, but then it doesn't work.
Not if you only shield like one side of it, the side that's towards your house.
Okay, so then you
Right.
just can't go outside.
Well, plus I would imagine that the transmitters in the appliances are going to have to be radiating 360 degrees. They're not going to be point to point.
Yeah.
They
Of
won't
course,
be able to, so.
when you get to the point of the appliances, then it's another story again.
Yeah.
Okay, so
That's
this is not an easy situation. Like I said, Blake sent a wonderful article out that shows that old houses in San Francisco that have chicken wire in the walls
Yes.
don't get any Wi-Fi and don't get any cell things. So you can
they're
build.
Going to be getting this.
They'll get this, yes.
They're going to get. They're going to get.
All right,
this.
so that technically you could cover your house all the way around with a Faraday cage. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the biggest thing that we need to instruct people to do is to make sure that their wishes are known, that this is not acceptable, that they have not given their permission to use their money to line the pockets of these extremely wealthy corporations on a technology which is not green. So Blake,
actually, there's a very interesting lawsuit that is in the courts right now against Northeast Utilities.
Oh.
And part of that lawsuit has to do with the concept of electronic trespass. So there may be a legal way to challenge this. I'm hoping that some environmental lawyers will step up to the plate. It's not that easy to sue federal agencies for schemes like this. Not schemes, for proposals like this, projects like this. But the concept of electronic trespass was upheld in a power line case in, I think, Colorado several years ago, and it's now in the courts for against Northeast Utilities that had to do with a power line that caused a disease in someone that where it was just too close to their house, and they did not take any remedial action to phase the current on the lines to reduce the fields, and it was a high exposure, and so the issue of that might be fruitful in terms of putting the kibosh on some of these.
Okay, so we're running out of time. The other thing is, I'm wondering whether small communities, like they have done in California in Marin County, which I haven't had a chance to look up yet, can form their own utility company and say no to this technology. That's another thing I'm going to be looking into. But the main thing is that people have to get on the phone. So, Blake, where do you want them to call?
Oh, I don't know.
I thought you had some suggestions. I can just go for it.
Well, if people are going to contact anyone, it should be their congressional representatives. It was through the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which was headed by Henry Waxman from California, I believe, who helped a lot of this. They need to if you just go online and Google smart grids, Department of Energy smart grids, a bunch of names and white papers and things like that will come up. People can just horse around that way. Contact your congressional reps and just say no. Just say no to your utility company, to whomever tries to approach you with this, and try to interest some public interest lawyers in filing electronic trespass.
Yeah, I'll be looking into that. In addition, I really think it's time for everybody to just jam PG&E's phone lines. Just jam their phone lines, call them up, say, I am concerned about this technology.
And the appliance manufacturers.
Well, I think the first step is the PG&E, because once they install this stuff, this infrastructure, you're not going to get it out of there. So the trick is to stop them before they put it in. And I think if people make an enormous amount of fuss, and maybe the PUC too, that they may slow down a little bit. We can at least slow them down by jamming their phone lines and just saying, no, we don't want this, we really don't want this.
Well, from a security perspective also, jamming devices can interfere with all of this information. Electromagnetic pulse technologies can interfere with these signals. There's any number. These are not secure systems. I don't care what they say. I mean, this is very, very ill-advised. Part of the reason that this is happening is an attempt to stimulate the economy through the technology sector in the same way that the Clinton administration stimulated the economy through the telecom sector.
Right, and all the money,
very much what's going on.
All the money went to very wealthy people, and it's our money.
Yeah.
Without our permission.
Yeah, but
again,
it's part of the overall financial economic plan that's in Washington at the moment. It's an attempt to stimulate the economy through this particular sector this time. And the same people are involved. Reed Hunt, who was the former director of the Federal Communications Commission during the telecom revolution, is now heading up a nonprofit organization that is lobbying the Obama administration for more money for exactly this issue. Al Gore is a big proponent of smart grids.
I know.
And
nuclear energy.
I'm sorry?
And nuclear energy.
Yes. Well, some very high-profile environmentalists are behind this, but I'm convinced it's because they don't understand the biological literature having to do with bioelectromagnetics. They don't get that piece of it. When you wave that off the table, this doesn't look like such a bad idea. The minute you put it back on the table, it's one of those oh my God situations.
Anybody else have anything to add? I should say one very quick thing, which is that I really am not allowed to tell you all to get on the phone and call PG&E. That just would be irresponsible. So I didn't really tell you to do that, but I'm going to do that, and I think it might be an interesting thing to do, and the PUC. Jeffrey, you had something.
I wanted to go back to this idea that Lena and I have been talking about small-scale public utilities. And one of Blake touched on this issue when she was describing the build-out of this system. This system is intended to make the existing structure of electric utility, electric power distribution work better.
Yep.
But from a genuine sustainability standpoint, the current structure doesn't work. There is a more sensible and green way to put these things together. So,
Too small to fail.
Too small to fail. You heard it here first.
Yeah.
I want to start a new national movement. Too small to fail. The smaller, the better.
Rooftop photovoltaics and all this other stuff is much better.
It's now. There was an article in the Chronicle last week that kind of argued that rooftop photovoltaics is the way to work. William McDonough and Michael Braungart, who wrote Cradle to Cradle, said buildings like trees, cities like forests. I mean, that's how you create a built environment, one that you don't generate electricity 200 miles away and ship it in. You generate it where you live.
Just so you know, one aspect of smart grid technology is to create the technology to allow rooftop installations exactly like what you're describing to feed power back into the system. It's a very imperfect system that we have right now, and that's one of the good parts of it. Like I said in the beginning, there are good parts of this that we probably should be encouraging. It's really the metering and the monitoring aspect of it that look to be the most problematic.
Well, and the antennas and towers everywhere.
Well, that's the metering and the monitoring.
Yes, okay. So we're just about out of time. I just want to let people know who they've been listening to. B. Blake Levitt is at blakelevitt.com, and she has a wonderful book that everybody should have on their shelves called Electromagnetic Fields, A Consumer's Guide to the Issues and How to Protect Ourselves. Wonderful book, blakelevitt.com. And then Michael Neuert, Neuert, at emfcenter.com is an electrical engineer who goes to people's houses and helps them with all this horrible stuff that's going on. And
can I say one thing?
It has to be really fast, yes.
This is probably the only program that has addressed this subject in this depth, and I thank you and Jeffrey for doing it.
Oh, well, thanks for getting on with us, too. So,
my pleasure.
I want to thank you all for listening. I'm Lena Berman. There's information about your own health and fitness, our guests, our book, and our book signing this Saturday, January 9th at 4 p.m. at Book Passage. Too Much Medicine, Not Enough Health. We also have a book page on Facebook. Our practice, our archive, access to CD copies, lots more at yourownhealthandfitness.org. Our information number is 707-874-2772. Your Own Health and Fitness is produced by Lena Berman and Jeff Fawcett, Ph.D. Remember, being informed not only protects your health, it protects your freedom.